Says it's live.
All right. We'll just wait just a couple more minutes to make sure that everyone who wants to join us is on, and then we'll get started. Thanks all who are joining us here. All right, well, happy World Oceans Day, everyone. I'm Laura Chamberlin from the WHSRN Executive Office and Manomet, and I also have with me Abby Sterling from the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative with Manomet. And we are here to talk about moonbirds and living fossils on this World Oceans Day, and we're glad that you have joined us. So to get us started out, we'll just say, as we said, it's World Oceans Day, June 8th, and people all around the world are now looking to learn more about the important role that oceans play in our ecosystems and what we can do to take action to support their to support a healthy ecosystem. So Abby and I work and what we can do primarily in shorebird conservation. However, the oceans are extremely important for shorebirds because they play a very important role in their habitat, with shorebirds, one of their key habitats being beaches and shorelines where they're able to feed and rest during their migration. And they also are found to be nesting on beaches. But today we're going to focus on one particular species that shorebirds interact with, and that is horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are sometimes called living fossils because they have been on Earth for over 450 million years, so that's longer than dinosaurs. And they can be found from Maine down to Mexico. And they are coming up on our sandy beaches and laying their eggs in the sand. You can see here in this picture, they're little tiny green eggs. They'll lay those eggs in the sand and then head back out to the water. And sometimes they're in estuaries during the spawning season, but then the majority of their life cycle they spend out in the oceans, often on the continental shelf. So these horseshoe crabs are pretty cool. They are 450 million years old, and they really haven't changed much in that time that they've been around. So they have book gills, which help them to breathe in the water. They are able to come out of the water for that brief period of time when they're laying their eggs, and they also can survive for a brief period of time, even with their gills kind of up in the air. They have legs to walk with. They look like claws, but if you see a horseshoe crab on the beach, just know that these are not claws, they are legs, and they really can't hurt you very much at all. They also have some pusher legs in the back, which you can see those in their tracks in the sand when you see them walking in the sand. And then their mouth is in between their legs, and they eat by moving their legs back and forth. And they're going to eat all kinds of different invertebrates and clams. I've even seen a video of them eating a dead fish. And so they kind of just crush things up and eat it. And one of the cool things is that you can tell the difference between males and females because the males have what we call a boxing glove. And it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but you can see this shape here. It's like a hook. And so they use that hook to hold on to the females during spawning. So the females are always larger than the males. And that's because they're carrying the eggs, which we'll get to in a minute. They are carrying a lot of eggs. And the males will hook onto the back of the female. She'll dig a hole in the sand, and then the males will, then she'll lay the eggs and then drag the male through the sand, and he will fertilize the eggs. So the female is always going to be larger because she's carrying those eggs, and she is carrying 80,000 to 100,000 eggs every season. And she'll come up on the beach maybe 4 to 5 times off the course of a month during the spawning season, which is typically all along the coast, can range from as early as March to July and August, depending on where you are. So they will spawn based on water temperature. So you might imagine in Florida and Mexico, they're going to start spawning earlier, and then in Maine, much later in the summer, because the water is going to take a little longer to warm up in Maine. I'm here on the Atlantic coast, and so right now, June is our peak time. May and June is a peak. The Delaware Bay is our peak season. So right now on the beaches around here in the Delaware Bay and all along the Maryland and Virginia coastline, they are out on the beaches spawning. So we are seeing these crabs out there right now. And here's a picture of them, of one female. You can just barely see her, and she has 5 males attached to her. And this is very common. We actually will frequently see 4 to 5 males for every female. And that's because the males will come up as much as they want. They will come up every day, every other day. The females are just going to come up 4 to 5 times over the month and lay those eggs over that month, but the males are coming up many, many times. And there is some research that shows that may be an advantage. It helps to provide lots of genetic material to those eggs, because there are lots of different males fertilizing one female. So being a horseshoe crab is hard. It's going to take about a month to hatch out of those tiny eggs, which you can see here, that are, about the size of a peppercorn. And then only about 3 out of 100,000 will survive the summer. So the odds are not good, but that's pretty typical for aquatic species. And they're going to molt 6 to 17 times from when they hatch to when they reach adulthood. And adulthood are the big horseshoe crabs that we most commonly see on the beach. You're not very often are you going to see a juvenile horseshoe crab. Maybe one of those molts might get tossed up on the beach, but otherwise they're staying in the water until they become spawning age. Another interesting thing about horseshoe crabs is that we do use their blood in the biomedical industry, and we capture between 400 to 600,000 crabs a year. And maybe there's different research that shows that anywhere from 15 to 30% might be dying from this practice. And they may also have reduced fitness, so they're maybe not able to survive or not able to move around as well. They're not able to find their good spawning beaches as well. And they may not even spawn in the years that they're bled, which can really be a challenge when we are looking to protect this really important ocean species. So we do have now a synthetic that was approved by the Federal Drug Administration to be used, as long as it is simultaneously tested with the current that we're using from the horseshoe crabs. As long as the synthetic is being used at the same time, then they can be shown to be effective. And we do have one pharmaceutical company that has been doing this, and in 2018, 3 of their facilities went online only using the synthetic, using about 80% of their work was being tested with the synthetic. So this is good news. We do need to see more of that happening in order to reduce the use of blood in the biomedical industry. So we're hoping to see more pharmaceutical companies look into how they can start to take this on. And one of the reasons why we are wondering and curious about how we can protect horseshoe crabs is that we also have shorebirds that are flying from far, far, far away, South America, and they're heading north to nest in the Arctic. and they have a real reliance on these horseshoe crabs. So I'm going to pass this to Abby and have her share how they're connected.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. So first of all, when we're thinking about shorebirds, it's important to acknowledge shorebirds are actually so much more than just the small birds that you see feeding in the surf or resting at the sand. You can go to the next slide. Generally speaking, shorebirds are a group of birds with long bills and long legs, and they're feeding on worms and invertebrates and clams and mollusks in wet, muddy, sandy areas where the water meets the land. So they can be found on beaches, but also they can be found along other waterways, even in grasslands. They don't swim, so they don't have webbed feet. Like if you look at this photo here, this guy does not have webbed feet, so they're not swimming like seabirds or ducks or anything like that. Specifically, today we're going to talk about a red knot. And the red knot is a medium-sized shorebird. It's about the size of a robin. And so they weigh typically about 120 grams. And keep that number in your head as we go forward. Generally speaking, about 120 grams. They have a long bill that they use to find food like horseshoe crab eggs and clams in wet sand. They have this kind of mottled plumage, so their feathers are really speckly. They're very gray in the winter months, but then as it gets into spring and they get ready to go up to the Arctic, they get these really beautiful red feathers, this kind of salmon colored breeding plumage. They have long pointed wings that are designed to really cover ground quickly with long primary feathers that help them fly quickly, and kind of these long thin legs and toes so they can wade in the water, move through the water at the edge of the sand in the water and find food. Now, when we see red knots in the spring, they're often in big flocks. And they are often with many other shorebirds feeding frantically. So in Delaware, where Laura is, and in the Georgia Bight, where I am, they are really looking for food resources. And one of the most important food resources for migrating shorebirds are horseshoe crab eggs. And this is a very cool picture that Laura took, right, Laura? With all different stages of horseshoe crab eggs. That's why they're all those different colors. So some of them are kind of drying out. Some of them are a little bit more developed. You can actually almost see the little horseshoe crabs in there. But those little green eggs are very abundant on the beaches during the spring. They're very easy to digest, and they are made up of pure energy. So those red knots eat them, and then they rest on the beaches, and then they feed some more, and then they rest again. And they do that throughout a couple weeks during the spring, storing up all the energy as fat that fuels them to fly thousands of miles without stopping, flapping their wings the whole entire time. And that fat breaks down as they fly. It turns into energy and water. So they don't even need to stop for a drink while they're flying all the way up to the Arctic. And so this is one of the most fascinating aspects of shorebird migration for me. You've got birds like red knots, but also like this ruddy turnstone that you can see here. And what they are doing is essentially, I kind of think of it, they are leading like a double life where we see them on the coast and on the Atlantic coast. Pretty much what they do is they eat like maniacs, and then they sleep, and then they eat some more. And what they're doing is finding all of those horseshoe crab eggs and other really nutrient-rich food to build up energy reserves that will take them all the way up to the Arctic. But they've got this really incredibly bright, colorful plumage. Like the ruddy turnstone here is like a little calico colored shorebird. You can go to the next one. And so on the Atlantic coast in the spring, we see them all over the beaches in this very bright plumage that makes them stand out. And they're looking for food and they're roosting, and it seems like that's the only thing that they care about. And when you see them doing that, dressed so brightly, it's pretty tough to understand why they would ever be so colorful. But then when they fly all the way to the north to their Arctic nesting sites, it makes perfect sense, right? This ruddy turnstone is now out on the tundra. This photo Shiloh Schulte took up in the Arctic. And you can just see why the turnstone is colored the way it is. It's dressed for the Arctic. So they'll leave our sunny, warm shores with the fuel to carry them all the way to the Arctic, where they need to find a mate, find a territory, lay eggs, and raise chicks in as little as 8 weeks because the Arctic summer is so short. You can go to the next one there. So this tremendous journey of a red knot here shows just how incredible these birds are. Some red knots go from the very, very southern tip of South America in places like Tierra del Fuego and fly thousands of miles without stopping on this tremendous road trip all the way up to their Arctic nesting grounds, kind of at the top of the world. And so they'll take these tremendous journeys, thousands of miles at a time, and stop at these very important staging sites. And so just like when we're on a really big road trip and you know your favorite gas station because it's got really good coffee and really good snacks, the red knots know exactly where they want to stop so that they can find good food resources and good safe places to sleep. And for a long time, we've known that Delaware Bay was a very important staging site for red knots. But now we've got new research out of South Carolina that shows that these birds are actually, some of them in the Southeast are able to find enough food resources to fly from the Southeast all the way up to the Arctic. And so this is really important. It's called site fidelity, and it means these birds know what spots they're going to stop at. And every single spring on the way north and fall on the way south, they're going to stop at these places. So these are super important sites that need to be protected.
And because of this, in 1986, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network was founded by a group of shorebird biologists and conservationists. And this network is working to protect shorebird habitat across the entire Western Hemisphere. And as Abby was just describing, the shorebirds are unique in that they have very specific places where they need to stop because they have just the right exact food resources that they need. And unfortunately, when you have just a few stops to make, you are really susceptible to the many threats that are out there. And if one site goes, that may be it for you and a successful migration. So right now, throughout the Western Hemisphere and the world, we know that we are facing many challenges from climate change, human development, and human development is a particular concern for shorebirds, as people and shorebirds both enjoy some of the same places, living along waterways. Human disturbance, recreation when we're out on those beaches, shoreline modification, as we have many more concerns with sea level rise and extreme storms. We are always looking for ways to control erosion, and that can be a concern for shorebirds. Invasive species throughout the landscape are increasingly becoming a problem. Aquaculture and water management and predation are all also threats that shorebirds are facing throughout the Americas. And so the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which we call WHSRN, which I think I used that acronym earlier, so I apologize for not saying what it was, but WHSRN is made up of 107 sites in 17 countries, and working with over 400 partners, we are working with on-the-ground site conservation to protect these important habitats for shorebirds. So it's not just red knots, as Abby was describing, the red knots that start in Tierra del Fuego and then maybe make a stop in Brazil, sometimes southern Brazil, Argentina, they often are stopping. But there's a flyway in the central mid-continental flyway, and then there's a Pacific flyway, which all have similar stories of species that have just a few stops that they make, and those stops are critical for their survival. And then they head up to the Arctic to nest. So the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, again, is in 17 countries, and we work with the partners on the ground, and these sites are all based on the landowners or the land managers committing to conservation. So the Delaware Bay was the first WHSRN site in 1987, and it is critically important over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of shorebirds, not just red knots, but semi-palmated sandpipers and ruddy turnstone, dunlin. Unfortunately, in the 1990s, on the Delaware Bay and actually throughout the Atlantic Flyway, there was overharvesting of horseshoe crabs, which led to fewer horseshoe crab eggs, which, as you might imagine, then caused a almost immediate decline in the shorebirds, particularly the red knots, but all of the shorebirds saw an 80% decline at the same time as the drastic decline in horseshoe crabs. And so that connection was immediate, and harvest limits have been put in place around near the Delaware Bay, and New Jersey has a moratorium, so there's no more harvesting in New Jersey, and that has helped to stabilize the population. But we still are seeing challenges and with recovery, and that is both the horseshoe crabs and the shorebirds. And I mentioned earlier the horseshoe crab bleeding, and we do know there is some loss from the horseshoe crab bleeding, so looking for ways to reduce the need for that. As well as reduced harvesting in other areas along the Atlantic coast is another potential area to help start to improve the recovery. And then for shorebirds, we really want to be working on these other threats that they have, like human disturbance when people are out walking on beaches, and other loss of habitat from climate change, sea level rise, development, shoreline modification.
And so in the Georgia Bight, we have some very similar challenges as well. Just like Laura mentioned, things like loss of habitat, climate change, sea level rise. But for us, one of the big issues is the harvest of horseshoe crabs for the biomedical industry. And so, we can think about it where when these crabs are taken right during the time that they're spawning, that definitely reduces the number of eggs that shorebirds can eat. And it means that they're not going to have the fuel to go up to the Arctic. And so, they need to hit a certain weight. They need to go from 120 grams all the way up to 180 grams. And you can watch over the course of a spring, birds get really, really fat before they fly up and they leave and they're just about ready to burst. They're so full of horseshoe crab eggs. And if they don't get the food resources that they need, they're not going to be able to make that flight successfully. And then when they get all the way up to the Arctic, they may not be able to be well fueled to find a territory and find a mate and lay eggs and raise their chicks successfully. So the things that we're seeing happening at these very important stopover sites have real implications for their success throughout the entire spring and summer. So that's why the harvest of horseshoe crabs can be so problematic at these important places. And then the disturbance is another really big threat in the Georgia Bight, not just from recreationalists, but also from people that are harvesting the horseshoe crabs. A lot of times in Georgia, we see red knots and other migratory shorebirds eating horseshoe crab eggs, and then they switch as the tide falls and start eating little coquina clams. And so if you've ever spent time in the Southeast, you've seen these little brightly colored tiny clams right in the sand. And so when people are out walking on the beaches, or there's dogs out on the beaches, they're scaring birds away that are trying to just find enough food to store all of the fuel that they need to get all the way up to the Arctic. So disturbance can be a really big problem too.
And Abby, one thing I think I forgot to mention when I was talking about the harvesting is they were harvesting the crabs for bait. That's frequently a question that we get. So they and this still occurs, that we harvest crabs to catch conch and eel. And what happened in the 1990s was there was a big increase in the need for conch and eel through sushi becoming more popular. So with all of these concerns of threats and that are happening throughout the Atlantic Flyway, particularly in these horseshoe crab habitats, what can we do? What can you do to help red knots and shorebirds and horseshoe crabs? So one of the quickest and easiest things that you can do if you do happen to live along the Atlantic coast and you have seen horseshoe crabs out, they are typically on beaches with low energy, so you might not see them on the ocean beaches as much, but in like a back bay estuary or in the Delaware Bay, for example, they're all on the bay beaches there. But you do sometimes see them on ocean beaches, and so when you do see them, you often will see them kind of feet up in the air, And this is because they can get turned over by the waves, and the quickest and easiest thing that you can do is just give them a quick turn. And as you can see, this volunteer is turning them over with two hands on the upper part of the shell, keeping clear of the hinge where the gills are moving back and forth, and she's not worried about the legs, because as I said earlier, their legs, not claws, so they're not going to pinch her. She'll flip him over and he'll walk down to the water. Sometimes if they're a little bit tired, you can give them a lift down to the water if they're particularly dried out. This helps
And Laura,
protect.
you don't have to worry about their tail, right? Their tail.
No, actually, thanks, Abby. The tail is not a stinger or anything. And also, please don't pick them up with the tail, because you can damage the tail by picking them up with that. And they are able to sometimes use their tail to flip themselves over. But you often will see some with short. You see this one here has a long one, and then there's one here that it's a little bit shorter. And so when they break, then it's not as useful to them. So yes, thank you. So they're not going to hurt you. They're very safe to touch. We work with volunteers as soon as they can walk, they can get out there and start helping horseshoe crabs. And in New Jersey, we have a program called Return the Favor, which helps us to organize volunteers to rescue on beaches. And so if you're in the New Jersey area, you can get in touch with us at returnthefavornj.org to learn more about that. In other areas where they might not have any formal rescue programs, you can still rescue crabs when you see them that need a hand. But we do have lots of, across the Atlantic coast, there are lots of programs where we have citizen science, and we are having volunteers come out to help with horseshoe crab surveys and horseshoe crab tagging. And so WHSRN and Manomet are not necessarily leading those programs in the different areas. In New York City Audubon has a program. I believe there's a program starting up in Massachusetts. So if you're curious about helping to find one, you can look around locally where you live, but you can also get in touch with us and we can help you find a program that might be just getting started, because there's a lot of folks now that are really trying to learn more about where the crabs are spawning, not just in those common places that we know, like in Georgia that Abby was speaking of, and in Delaware Bay, but all along the coast. So we really want to learn more about what's going on. And so one of the things we do is we count them. We have a protocol for counting the crabs across the beach. And then we also put tags in them to monitor where their movements and where they're going, and if they return to the same beaches and things like that. And so another thing that we're doing to help shorebirds is, if you can imagine that this is a beach in the Delaware Bay. So Abby and I were talking quite a bit about hundreds of thousands of shorebirds coming, and it's really hard for us to share with you what that looks like. Here's one attempt at showing a beach that is covered in shorebirds, and they're all here scurrying around trying to feed on those eggs. Now you can see off in the distance, you can see a couple of people. Now, as you might imagine, because I'm sure most of you have been on a beach and you have flushed up some birds. What would happen if these people came walking down the beach? Probably well-intentioned people that just wanted to get a better look at these really cool birds. These birds would fly, right? Because they are afraid of people and they do not want to be near them. So we do some work both in New Jersey as well as across the coastline. We have different areas that are closed off, or we provide education for people so that they will share the shore with shorebirds, because it's just for a brief period of time that these migrating shorebirds are heading up from South America to the Arctic. And so it's easy for us to provide them that space where they can feed undisturbed or roost. Abby shared some pictures of huge flocks of shorebirds roosting on the beaches in between feeding sessions. So it's really important for us to give them that space and keep our dogs leashed and walk in areas that aren't going to disturb the shorebirds.
And migration is not the only thing that's happening at this time of year. There's also nesting birds. And so we just wanted to extend the idea about trying to reduce our disturbance of birds from just those migrating birds that we're trying to be a good host to while they're here for a short window, to include nesting birds too. And so from in the southeast here, nesting goes from about March to August. And we've got a variety of nesting shorebird species along the Atlantic coast. So these are Wilson's plovers, and like many beach nesting birds, they make a little depression in the sand, they lay their eggs in the sand, and then they hatch and they have little fuzzy chicks that are running all over the beach. And you can see both the eggs and the chicks blend in really well with their surroundings. And that's one of their main defenses, is they try to hide. And so because they try to stay hidden, it is very easy for people to inadvertently be in the places where the shorebirds are trying to nest. So if you see signs or any ropes or exclosures, areas that are closed off for nesting birds, this time of year, we try to give birds plenty of space so that they're able to nest successfully on our beaches. And yeah. And so it's not just people. The other thing is it's very important, if you can, to keep your dogs either off the beach or leashed when they're on the beach, to give the birds plenty of space, because birds are afraid of dogs, even if it's your sweet dog that just loves his tennis ball. To a shorebird, your dog looks like a predator, like an Arctic fox, if it's a migrating red knot that's about to go up to the Arctic, or maybe even a coyote. And so when you're out on the beach, one of the easiest ways to share the beach with nesting shorebirds is to stay on the wet sand below the tide line. So shorebirds can nest anywhere from the tide line up into the dunes and even behind the dunes. And so during nesting season from March to August, we ask folks to sort of look to the tide line and then stay below it on the wet sand, which is convenient because in the middle of summer when it's really hot, the wet sand is the nice place to be anyways, nice and cool down there for us.
All right. And I think this is something that we maybe didn't mention earlier, but there are shorebirds obviously that are nesting along our Atlantic coast. So there we have shorebirds that are migrating long distances to the Arctic, but also shorebirds that are going to nest locally in our area here on the Atlantic coast. So there's a wide diversity of shorebirds. So if you are interested in learning more about how you can take action and stay connected to shorebird conservation and horseshoe crab conservation, you can find us at manomet.org, WHSRN.org. If you're in the New Jersey area, please check out returnthefavornj.org. It's a great program that would be happy to have new volunteers next year. We're almost to the end of our season now. And then for those of you that are not in the New Jersey area, please check out hscrabrecovery.org, where you can learn more about actions that are happening across the entire Atlantic coast to protect horseshoe crabs and support their recovery. All right. So do we have any questions out there? This is our first time doing a Facebook Live, so we're not sure how we're going to see the questions, but please, if you can type in questions and we'll try to get to them. All right, I'm just looking to see. Abby, anything to share from your most recent visit to the beach?
I think I'm so excited for people to get the opportunity to learn a little bit more about this connection. I mean, like you said, these horseshoe crabs were around before dinosaurs. And I think for anybody that's lucky enough to get to see the connection between horseshoe crabs that depend on our oceans, and then the connection between shorebirds that have been for thousands of years fueling their migration up to the Arctic, dependent on horseshoe crabs, you know, it's an opportunity to see a really incredible natural phenomenon. You don't need to go all the way to Africa to the Serengeti to see huge movements of animals, you know, with wildebeest migrations. I think shorebird migration is just as spectacular. And so getting the chance to learn
Absolutely.
about it, and then even participating in some of these programs or some of these efforts to help protect horseshoe crabs so that we can maintain this link between horseshoe crabs and shorebirds is a super meaningful, really, really cool way to connect to our shorelines and to our oceans.
Yeah, and I not to brag, but I have been to Africa. I've been to the Serengeti. And I will tell you, that was before my time here working on the Delaware Bay. And when I came to the Delaware Bay, I lived an hour from the Delaware Bay in Maryland. And I had never seen the horseshoe crabs spawning like they spawn here, where they're covered across the beaches. I've never seen shorebirds like they are here. And it was truly just as amazing, if not more amazing, than the things that I saw in Kenya. So
Yeah.
it truly is something to see, and I hope those of you out there that live nearby can get a chance to find this and see this. And we do have some information on WHSRN.org about when and where to see shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. So we did have one question come in. What are raptors a particularly deadly predator for shorebirds?
I think especially during fall migration, peregrine falcons actually follow the southbound migration of shorebirds, and it's a really neat to see. And it helps you very much understand why a bird like a red knot has long pointed wings, so it can fly quickly and so it can evade a falcon in the way that it does. And it's another a good reason for these shorebirds all feeding in big groups so they can have you know, collective defense and all kind of be together to try to confuse or evade predators like falcons. And so
Yeah, and we do have on the Delaware Bay the peregrine falcons have figured out which beaches have a lot of shorebirds on them. So we do see them out there hunting on a regular basis. And you can always tell when there's a falcon out there, because the birds are moving and flying and trying to evade those predators, which is not good for the birds, because they again need to be feeding nonstop, right? So but that's natural, and as long as humans are not increasing that with our disturbance, they can manage. Another question that came in was, what about horseshoe crabs and predators? So horseshoe crabs, not necessarily raptors, but sharks and alligators,
loggerhead sea
seagulls,
turtles.
yeah, sea turtles. When I was the first time I went to Georgia, we were at a really cool intersection of an ecosystem where we had horseshoe crabs spawning, loggerhead turtles probably trying to get to the horseshoe crabs that were spawning, and then the shorebirds were there eating the eggs, and there were also terrapins, diamondback terrapins, which will also eat horseshoe crab eggs, as a lot of other species in these estuaries are going to feed on horseshoe crab eggs. So it was really cool to see all these different species intersecting in this one moment in time, and how important it is for an ecosystem to have all its members in the food chain. Another question here. So was that a picture of a shoreline completely covered with horseshoe crabs, an old black and white photo? So there is a black and white photo that is actually a picture of horseshoe crabs piled up on the beaches. I believe it's from, so this is not spawning, this is crabs that have been harvested. And I believe that this is from when they used to harvest the crabs for fertilizer. Mm-hmm. That was in particular, I'm not sure down in the Southeast, Abby, you might know, but definitely in the Delaware Bay area, they harvested them for fertilizer because there was so many. They were covering the beaches piled high, and it was really easy for them to go out and just collect them up and throw them into a cart or into a truck. And now when you talk to people who have lived on the Bayshore their whole lives, they will tell you stories of when the crabs were very dense and covered on the beaches, and you never went out on the beach from April to July because it smelled so terrible from dead crabs. It's not like that anymore. Any other questions out there? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us on World Oceans Day. We are glad to be here sharing with you all the things that we love, shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. And hopefully you'll come back and we will try to share another story with you next time.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.